Good morning, everyone. It's 11 a.m. Central. I see a few people are joining us fast and furious, so we'll give everybody 30 more seconds before we get started off with our webinar today. All right, looks like we seem to have leveled off with our attendees who are joining us. Once again, thank you for making time to join us on this webinar. My name is Nik, and I am a part of the Relativity solutions team. I'm a solutions architect here, helping Relativity users better understand how to make the most of the eDiscovery platform. I worked in eDiscovery for about the past 10 years managing legal and technology projects. In today's webinar, we will be discussing cyber risks with John deCraen. John presented on this topic at Relativity Fest last year, and we've decided to bring it back today based on some popular demand that we have heard out in the field. John is a senior director with Alvarez Marsal, disputes and investigations practice, specializing in global cyber risk services and digital forensics. Joining A&M in 2004 from the finance industry, he has since been involved in computer forensics, cybersecurity, and IT risk matters, performing various management, investigatory, and analytical assignments for global clients in a multitude of industries. John, thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little about your background and the types of clients you work with and what makes them unique.
Hey, Nick, good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and to discuss this topic with you today. As you said, I've been with Alvarez Marsal since 2004. Prior to joining that, I ran the data centers for a couple of large finance industries. So that background of that sort of global infrastructure, enterprise infrastructure, has been pulled forward into my consulting career. And over the course of the 14 years at Alvarez, I've moved through various industry phases, beginning with computer forensics and e-discovery, then moving into cybersecurity, where I've been for the last 7 or so years. Most of my background in e-discovery was based upon the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy engagement. Alvarez Marsal was lucky enough to have been awarded sort of the administrator of the Lehman estate, and as part of that function, we processed and handled all of the litigation on behalf of the Lehman Brothers. And as you can imagine, it was very sizable. We collected somewhere in the tune of north of a petabyte worth of data and have served documents or litigation and other matters to about 150 plus individual litigation matters. So we learned quite a bit of lessons throughout that e-discovery life cycle, as you can imagine, a lot of it having to do with regulatory compliance and what we needed to do to secure the data and to secure ourselves from the client data, because as we'll discuss today, some of our biggest risks in e-discovery come from the fact that we're pulling in unknown client data into our own processing systems and then forwarding that data on to other entities. And so we'll talk about a little bit of that today and sort of how we've learned the lessons through e-discovery and what we need to talk about when it comes to e-discovery and cybersecurity, and they go hand in hand. And I look forward to discussing that with you today.
Thank you for that introduction, John. Seems like the background is really very varied and very apt for our topic today. So here's a quick agenda of what we'll discuss. We talk about why cybersecurity is important, understanding the 3 pillars of cybersecurity, cybersecurity specifically around e-discovery, cybersecurity breach causality, how to avoid some of these risks, some takeaways on what you can take away at the end of this webinar. And we'll get into questions as we go along, and also allocate some time towards the end to address some of these questions that come in. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll pick them up as we go along. So with many high-profile breaches, cybersecurity has become a popular topic in various industries around the world. John, from your experience, how seriously do you think the e-discovery industry takes cybersecurity?
One of the things that I have found in my travels and in dealing with so many clients is that, like other industries, everybody's been putting their eggs into the basket of perimeter protection. And while that is absolutely a fundamental, strategy in protecting your own environment, one of the things that I find more often than not, zero attention has been paid to. Once I have my client files and I'm processing those, having the proper cybersecurity protocols in place to not only protect yourself, to protect the company that you work for and the systems you're processing this data on, but then turning around and exporting that data and making deliveries to other entities, the courts, other sides, the plaintiffs, defendants, and sending that data out, having really no knowledge about sort of the condition of those files from a cybersecurity perspective. And, are we propagating malware to our own clients and to our own other third parties that we're involved in litigation with? That is really where I see most e-discovery processing vendors really not spending the right amount of time.
That's interesting. So that takes us into some of these this topic about the 3 pillars of cybersecurity. Can you provide us a few examples of each?
I absolutely can. So when we talk about cybersecurity and we talk about strategies, one of the fundamentals that we need to understand before we can have solid strategies are what I refer to as the 3 pillars. And those 3 pillars are threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. And I believe it's critical that we understand the differences between these 3 sort of buckets of things that we need to be concerned about, because many people often confuse the differences between vulnerabilities and risks. So if you don't mind, we'll take a minute and we'll go into each of those 3 topics and sort of level set for everybody to make sure that we're all on the same page and talking about things in the same way. So the first are threats. And a threat is defined as any action, whether that's a potential action or the inaction of an individual, that is likely to cause harm or loss. And we usually quantify threats by multiplying the capability of, in this case, our bad actor and their intent. So what kind of threat are we talking about? Are we talking about, it's a 17-year-old in mom's basement, often referred to as the script kiddie? Or are we talking about corporate espionage, or in some cases, law firm espionage, or state players who might very well be interested in a particular litigation case that we're working on? So understanding who your adversaries are, the threats that we face, is the first fundamental calculation that you need to undertake. You need to be realized that most of the organizations that I speak with will often tell me on day 0, well, I only make toothpicks. Who in the world would want to steal my data? Well, I think that is sort of far-sighted a little bit, because I think oftentimes people neglect to see that many of the threats we face today are not actually aimed at us. They're bad actors, criminal intent or otherwise, who are looking to steal very large sets of data that in the aggregate, these source pools of data are very valuable. They're able to monetize these very large sources of data. And when we compound that threat with the fact that we're in litigation, and it very well might be that some of our litigants are famous people, or they're infamous, or that the litigation we're working on has been newsworthy and that people are aware of these, you might find that there are bad actors out there who would take advantage of this litigation processing phase to try to get their hands on some of this data. So let's understand who our threats are, who are we facing, and the kind of things that we need to be worried about. The second, I think, is the one that's most often misunderstood, and that is vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is a specific gap in the protection of your assets that can lead to an exploit of by a threat actor and cause us a risk, right? So I've referenced risk, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to be sure that everybody understands vulnerabilities. It used to be, and I spent a really long time in IT, that we only spoke about vulnerabilities in the context of, oh, my Windows operating system requires a couple of patches. These vulnerabilities need to be handled so that our systems are up to date. Well, I think it's really important that this audience understand that vulnerabilities come in all shapes and sizes. These are just not Windows hot fixes that we're concerned about anymore. These are network firmware updates. These are network configurations that cause us vulnerabilities. Truly, a vulnerability is in any asset that we use to protect our data, whereas that asset is not used to its fullest extent. Right? So if we have a Windows operating system and it's missing a couple of key security patches, that server is not able to provide the highest extent of protection. So when you think about asset vulnerabilities, you really need to be open-minded to consider all of the kind of vulnerabilities that contribute to the risks that we undertake. So as far as risks are concerned, risk is the resulting damage or harm or the loss of an unmitigated vulnerability to a threat. So we assume a vulnerability is going to lead to, in this scenario that I'm depicting for you, lead directly to a breach. The breach itself is the risk. The risk isn't the unpatched system. The risk ultimately here is something we can quantify. Because of this unpatched system, I am assuming that if somebody breaks in, this is how they would do it. This is the exploit they would use because I know this vulnerability. So a quantifiable collection of vulnerabilities equal risks. And many people conflate that, and they think that risks and vulnerabilities are the same thing. And we do a lot of mind mapping for clients in our engagements, and we sort of lay this out for them so that they can understand how we quantify these vulnerabilities times the threat potential equals our risk. You do have to think about all three pillars independently, and you do have to have some way of quantifying each of these three pillars so that you can come up with what we refer to as a risk tolerance model. What can we assume as a e-discovery processing vendor as a risk? And when we talk about e-discovery, we're talking about clients' data. We're talking about data from the world that we should automatically assume is dirty. And during the e-discovery processing phase, many of the systems we use, many of the processes we use, we've found out over time that we've got to turn off things like antivirus, malware scanning in order to even get through the processing phase. So automatically, we've assumed vulnerabilities to our process and to our data storage, thereby assuming risks that we might not even have intended to, allowing a threat actor to exploit us in these areas. And that can come in a way of, I processed a PDF file that's been weaponized 2 or 3 years ago in my client's network. And I've pulled that data into my e-processing. And when I touch that with my processing engine, I activate that weaponized PDF file. And now I have a risk of infecting my own system.
That's very interesting that you mentioned vulnerabilities and risk are two different things, and people assume the two to be similar. On the same lines of applying it to e-discovery, are there more industry-related vulnerabilities and risks that you can talk to us about?
Sure. Like every industry, we share a certain level of communal risk, right? We all use Windows operating systems or Linux operating systems. We're all using SAN or NAS type storage. We're all using network devices. So we're assuming sort of the same basic package of vulnerabilities and risks as every other industry on the planet. But then we compound that because unlike a lot of industries, we're not generating our own work product per se, right? We're taking data that's been given to us by some third party. In a lot of cases, this is just a business relationship. We don't actually know much about that client. We don't know anything about that client's particular ways of protecting themselves, but yet then we don't bother to ask or to do any investigation on the data that we pull in. So on top of everything else that every industry assumes, e-discovery processors are also assuming additional risk because they have this huge black hole, unknown, unquantifiable set of risks that they take every time they take a new client or a new delivery from a
client. That probably ties into the e-discovery lifecycle that you have in here. So how does that tie in?
Sure. First of all, I have found my experience with e-discovery vendors is there's little to no sort of import security. Are we scanning the files that we're receiving from our clients? How well have we architected our onboarding systems, right? Our secure FTP or physical deliveries? Do we just plug those machines in and download that set of PST files and off we go to the races for processing? Or do we stop and look at that data with a cybersecurity eye to determine whether or not there are, weaponized files within them, malware indicators of compromise that we should be aware of? Do we segment our receiving systems from our processing systems, from our presentation or web review systems, so that as we move data through the phases of e-discovery, we're not bringing forth into those final stages that malware, the weaponized documents? I also think that most e-discovery vendors have very weak defensive and detective postures. Like many industries, money is spent on the perimeter and not on sort of the squishy center of our network, right? We spend a great deal of money on router protections, firewalls. We want to do intrusion detection and all these things on the perimeter. And again, all of those things are extremely fundamental to protecting ourselves. But do we do things like segment the network and look at the traffic between segments? Do we scan files? Are we looking for indicators of compromise as data travels on our network from one point to the other? So instead of just looking at the actual PST files we get from our client, we should also be comprehensively looking at the data as it travels on our network, like most other large corporations who are using, SIEMs and SOC staff to sort of look at this in a forensic way to try to determine, are we passing data from one segment of our network to the other, or have we been infected and that weaponized file is now looking to propagate itself to a different segment, or looking to raise its privileges on another processing system and ultimately get an administrator account. We also find that many e-discovery vendors do no malware scanning on the data that they're receiving in the responsive evidence. And I think this applies to both import and export. So if imagine in a scenario, you've pulled in a .doc from a client, and that .doc has been weaponized and you didn't scan for that file. Now you have infected your systems, and you then do your web review and counsel finds that that's a responsive document, and out the door it goes to, say, the court or some third party. You have just infected that court or that third-party system by providing them with that infected file. And in some ways, you've assumed liability for that infection if they should ever file suit or commence an investigation as to how maybe the court got infected. I think that you're going to begin to see in the next several years that this sort of become the liability of e-discovery vendors and not the end client in this case. I also am disturbed by the fact that there's really no regulatory or legal guidance to e-discovery vendors. Many industries today have either a federal regulator or a state regulator framework that they must comply with, right? A SOC 2 or PCI DSS or any one of these. But there really is no framework, no cybersecurity controls to follow in the e-discovery process. So as processors, we need to take it upon ourselves to determine a few things. What kind of clients do we have? What industries are our clients in, right? So if you imagine you have a client who's a healthcare provider and they're sending you lots of records. If you're processing these systems that aren't HIPAA compliant, you immediately have broken the HIPAA expectations and you now are liable for those HIPAA controls, right? So you should have signed a business agreement with the third party. You should be prepared to import that data into a HIPAA compliant container. Same goes for PCI, same goes for any number of other industry regulations. As e-discovery vendors, we have the burden and the liability to make our systems compliant with the high watermark of our clients. So if we have a client that really has no expectations, we still owe them the minimum expectations of cybersecurity. But then if we also have clients who have these elevated controls, PCI or high trust, then we owe them, both legally and sort of business responsible to them, to provide them the protections that they have to provide their clients. And to me, that is one of the biggest failures of e-discovery vendors today. They don't understand or recognize their legal burden to be compliant with the processing regulations of their ultimate client.
The earlier example you gave about the weaponized doc file sounds like a nightmare scenario, but it actually ties well into our poll question that we have right now, which is security around which area of e-discovery keeps people up at night. So here are some of the options: information governance and risk and compliance, preservation, collection and import, processing and analysis, review and production, and people have no security concerns and can sleep like a baby. So we'll give people 30 more seconds to respond. We see some responses coming in. I'm very intrigued by the 3% of people who say they can sleep like a baby. Let's hope it was an accidental click. So while the audience is taking the poll, in terms of security, do you have any tips for what to look for when selecting a service provider?
Absolutely. The first thing out of the gate, and typically as a cybersecurity, and I'll put my cyber purist hat on, I do not emphasize compliance. My job is typically not to tell you whether you're compliant with the framework or not. My job is to tell you whether you're secure, which is another level of sort of expectations. But I do think it's really important as a vendor that you are looking to sort of promote yourself as compliant with your clients. You want to be just like your clients. Again, if your client's a healthcare provider, then you need to mimic their expectations before you can, with a straight face, tell them, I'm going to protect your data in the way that you are expected to protect that data when you take it from your clients. And in this HIPAA case, patients, right? And that's right now a very hot topic in the federal government is sort of medical records and PII. All 50 states in the past calendar year have either passed or promoted some form of legislation for notification requirements, right? So as an e-discovery vendor, if you are infected by your client's data, you have the same notification requirements that your client does. You fall into the same legal category as your client does. And we find oftentimes that e-discovery vendors miss that mark. They don't understand that burden very well.
That is,
I am encouraged.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm encouraged by the responses I see on the poll here. More than a third of folks say that governance, risk, and compliance, and then again, 30% say the preservation, collection, and import, which is exactly the sort of sentiment and attitude that I hope to hear. I'm glad to see folks are concerned about this because they very well should.
Yeah, I was about to cover the poll results too. I'm glad you did. So tying it back into our e-discovery world and the EDRM, can you provide us pointers on what practitioners should keep in mind in each stage of e-discovery?
Absolutely. So everybody here will recognize the e-discovery reference model, and I think we provided a link at the back. If you're not familiar with it, you should absolutely be, because it helps us categorize sort of the various phases of, taking the documents all the way through the process and maybe giving documents to that third party. So I've bucketed these slightly different than most folks might, because I wanted to sort of demonstrate where our concerns are. So the first bucket that I've described here would simply be the information governance bucket. And I think this is some of what we've talked about already. Understanding or misidentifying the regulatory controls that you have a legal liability to be compliant with. I think this is sort of the first stop in the conversation to making sure that we're secure, because we should be looking to guidance from other folks. We spend a great deal of time at Alvarez sort of mapping regulations and control expectations and helping clients understand where that high watermark is. If you have 3 different levels of expectations from a regulatory compliance perspective, you have a burden to make sure that you've taken that highest level of expectation and you have pushed that across your network. So to me, right away, I think the first thing, because there's no regulatory guidance, folks feel like they don't really have a burden to be secure or compliant. And that absolutely is not true. You have a legal burden to be compliant with your client's lowest level of expectations. And we're going to see suits more and more and more where e-discovery vendors are not compliant. And God forbid there be a breach. Now we have a HIPAA violation, and that's going to trickle down to the ultimate client. And I would not want to be in that pretrial conference, because I think that's going to cost folks lots of money. Folks just don't understand the industry threats. They think that because they're isolated sort of from the world, in other words, we're only processing data that's given to us from, quote, a known entity, that we don't have the same sort of worldly concerns that everybody else does. I think that's absolutely untrue and a misleading sentiment.
Seems like a second one is around preservation, collection, and import.
Yes. So, most vendors today are receiving data directly from their clients. They're not going to sites and sort of doing the farming themselves. They're getting PSTs, they're getting EDBs and forensic images from folks, and they're sort of processing it. Most consultancy firms still sort of have that on-site sort of forensic collection. And one of the things that I would encourage processing vendors to do is to hire staff and or train staff that they have on site already to be prepared to collect data in a forensic manner. If your client's just offering to send you a PST file through an SFTP site, I don't suggest that it's necessary for you to argue with them that you need to go on site and do the PST collection yourself. But I do think that you should strategize to have some small questionnaire for that client about how that PST was collected, where it came from, who the ultimate custodian was, even if it's not the litigant in the matter, just to make sure that we are prepared for the kind of data that we're taking on, having the right forensic processes in place to make sure that we're exploding that file in a forensic and sound manner, and that we're isolating that initial explosion of the container that we receive in an isolated environment, so that we are not bleeding those sort of weaponized files into our processing environment. There's nothing wrong with having a DMZ. As a matter of fact, it's encouraged to pull your data in initially from your clients. Your first look at that client data should not be on your processing systems. Unhygienic collection methodologies. We just talked about how most vendors today are receiving data from their clients. We really need to know how this data was collected. Did somebody just go to a live box and just literally export that PST? Well, that process, as they did that to the USB, could have infected the USB, and now they put that in FedEx and send that to you, and you plug that into your system. I think you can follow here where my biggest concerns are from a collection and preservation standpoint. And then the one that really worries me the most is, and this is e-discovery agnostic, right? This can be any industry. The biggest concern we have as cybersecurity guys today is network segmentation. The ability to segment the various portions of the e-discovery reference model to itself. So import is a network segment to itself, and that data cannot move from that sort of pre-processing environment to our processing environment unless we control that move, and that only the things that we say go from point A to point B go from point A to point B, and that in so much as we have segmented our network, we're also collecting the logs from those various VLAN devices so that we can forensically review that traffic to determine if we've taken on a file that we didn't notice. Is that file trying to propagate? Do we see indicators of lateral movement? Do we see that file having been exploded into various smaller components on a processing system that we might not have noticed having antivirus or malware on there? Network segmentation, data segmentation is very important. And I think a lot of vendors today are sort of used to being told by their clients that they have to segment their data in some logical way just to keep their data away from other clients. That's a really good idea. We should continue to do that. But we should drive that down one more layer in the OSI model, down and get that data physically segmented onto different processing systems, different bare metal.
And your third bucket is around processing and analysis.
Yes. Here oftentimes, because we've imported dirty data, and I think the biggest risk here is in e-discovery. If we turn on antivirus or IDS or HIDS on our local machines or any of these other protective technologies, we can't process the data. So one of the things that's really important here is understanding what is the protocol when we come across a system or a file that's been weaponized. We can't process that in our systems because that is a risk to us. That's a risk to third parties. So what do we do? How have we decided how we're going to handle those files? Have we agreed with the other parties in litigation how that would be handled, how we might advise the court of these quarantine files and things? Again, network segmentation here is extremely important through all various phases, because of course you might accidentally process a file that's been infected by malware, but the very last thing you want to do is present that file for review, and then God forbid counsel want to download that file for a physical inspection or a reading offline. And then now they've pulled that infected file down onto their systems, making us liable for infecting some third party. And the final thing that ties to network segmentation here, I think, is the ineffective or completely absent network and server log aggregation and analytics. We talked about looking for the lateral movement, looking for account promotions after malware has been exploded. Are we able to see the kind of data moving from one subnet to the other? Do we understand the kind of traffic? Have we worked to block the kind of traffic that may be dangerous to us? Or do we simply plug everything into one big flat network? All the servers got the same subnet address, and they're all just happily processing data and sharing these files between themselves. To me, that is a massive risk in any industry. And we spend a lot of time with very large corporations helping them understand a more strategic way to segment their network. It's unfortunately an expensive thing to do, especially if you're a very large organization and you're already been running, you're a 50-year-old company, you've got a 30-floor office tower, and now I'm telling you, you have to segment this network that's been flat for 30 years. That's an undertaking, and I would suggest that as e-discovery vendors look at sort of deprecating their current environments and moving into new versions of processing and tools that they might use, that they begin to sort of understand how that network segmentation may be affecting them and make salient plans to be able to do that. Having somebody on site, having somebody that has the right skill sets, training, and even certifications to do the log aggregation and the analytics. Don't just trust a SIM in a box. Don't just download a tool and hope that those pre-canned filters are going to give you what you need. This is an area where it will cost money to do right, but it is 100% worth the return on investment.
And your fourth bucket is around review and productions.
Yeah, this is where the real rubber meets the road, right? So we take a risk for ourselves, and that's fine for your own particular vendor, right? The company that you work for. If you guys decide that your risk tolerance is that we're happy processing potentially weaponized files on our own network, then God bless, you guys do that. But when you start producing data to a third party, when you start sending data out to other litigants or to the court, you are assuming a risk that really is not your place, right? You represent your client, and you should absolutely be doing so in a way that protects them ultimately. Because I think at the end of the day, if a client gives you a file that's been has malware, has been weaponized in some way, you process that file, you don't notice because you don't have sort of the due diligence in place to notice or prevent that, and then you produce that file to another third party that you then infect. I think that you are assuming sort of a liability that most folks at e-discovery vendors leadership probably wouldn't assume if they understood it thoroughly. So, you know, part of this focus of this whole conversation is to get people talking about these things so that leadership at these various organizations understand the risks they're taking. One of the things that's foremost on the stuff that we talk about with our clients is risk tolerance. You cannot decide what is a risk worth taking if you do not understand the risks and the vulnerabilities and the threats, as we talked about earlier, that affect you directly, or more importantly, affect your clients. So you're assuming and then passing on these assumed risks to third parties without ever even bothered to understand how those risks might affect you or the third party. It's extremely important that we're not infecting third parties. God forbid that ever you make a production one day and it goes to a state regulator or some other government organization. I think they're going to come knocking eventually because these regulators are starting to get hit. We spend a lot of time with federal and state regulators, and the buzz is they're starting to look down the chain. And this isn't just e-discovery, this is sort of all industries. Regulators have sort of gotten hip to this now. They want to move the liability as far down the chain as possible and start holding people responsible for these things. And I think you'll begin to see regulatory fines, HIPAA fines, HHS coming down on processors, things like that, when this data is not being protected in the manner that's expected of them.
Thanks for sharing that, John. At this point, I think we have, it's time for another poll. So the question is, what do you think is the #1 driver in most cybersecurity breaches? So you have, you're welcome to jump in and answer the poll. We have it open for another 30-40 seconds. So while we're collecting the responses, John, what are your thoughts on this? We have few options in here: ineffective leadership and culture, poor detective processes, unavailable user awareness or training, and ineffective perimeter protection.
If it wasn't critical to choose one for the sake of this discussion, I would say all of the above are true for sure. It is absolutely my impression, and I am a little surprised by this, but I agree in some way. To me, what I find today is an ineffective leadership position and a culture of, well, that's not my data, so I don't really care. So I'm only a processor. It's not my burden to worry about these kind of things. Client gave me this file, so the client's burden is on this file. Truth be told, we don't believe that's true anymore. So I think leadership that is ineffective from a cybersecurity perspective, while it may be fantastic from a business or an e-discovery or a data analytics perspective, not having the right cybersecurity leadership is very dangerous in today's world. So I'm a member of a number of RSS feeds, as you can imagine, and I am now receiving an average of 11 to 13 cybersecurity breaches every single day. In the state of California, yesterday I did a quick check on their website. They had 37 announced breaches last week in the state of California. Now, these are only the ones that have been reported, and it is in every industry, every size company. that is sort of a reflection of our current leadership and our culture today. It's really sort of inexcusable that we're having sort of a lot of these breaches. And if you tear into these breaches, I think my experience shows that ultimately, at the end of the day, this falls on leadership and overall organizational culture. I do agree, though, the poll shows nearly 50% awareness and training, and that is absolutely a byproduct of ineffective leadership and culture. If you're not receiving training, say you process medical records most of the time, your main client base is healthcare providers, and you're processing HIPAA data. If you are not doing user awareness training on HIPAA compliance, first of all, you're not compliant with HIPAA because that's a requirement. And then two, you're doing a disservice to your clients because your processors should absolutely understand and are required by law to understand HIPAA user awareness and training information. And that data, the information and training is fairly cheap on the internet. You can go buy these training modules for fairly cheap or develop them yourself. But I do find that is a direct result of sort of what I understand is sort of a lackadaisical culture. And again, this is not e-discovery. This is every industry that we kind of run into. It's really only the folks at the top that get this, and they're doing a poor job of pushing that information down through user awareness and training and other things. I would say not to discount, however, both the detective processes and the perimeter protections. While again, most folks today, because the culture over the last 8 to 10 years has been to protect the perimeter, and there are a lot of tools, and folks are doing a better job at that today. But the detective processes, having the tools, the trained and skilled staff, and eloquent filters on our detective measures to understand what is flowing on our network today can't be underestimated.
Thank you for that. So at this point, let's get into breach causality. Can you tell us more around this? What are the common causes for cybersecurity breaches?
Sure. I'm sorry, I'm changing my slides here, getting caught up. So the first and foremost is cybersecurity awareness. I think the reason that most companies are breached today is they simply do not understand the threats against them. They don't understand their industry. Again, we spend a lot of time with these sort of multinational corporations, and they have these huge myriad of regulations, whether that be GDPR, PCI, DSS, all these various factors that influence the decisions that they make, that most of those folks don't understand how those regulations affect the way that they configure their systems. And the awareness of their situation and their liability, they fall short on that. They've not sat down and created a charter for their company, for their processes, and said, from this charter, we're going to create these set of policies, processes, and various mechanisms in place to make sure that we're not, one, getting infected, and two, passing that infection to other folks. Most folks today, I think, refuse to acknowledge the threats that they face. So I gave an example earlier about we only make toothpicks. That's a real life example, a very large company. The product is made up for sake of example, but it's a very true story where I've been to a very large company and they said to me, we only make, quote, toothpicks. I don't understand why anybody would steal from us, or I don't understand why we'd be at risk for a breach. Understanding that you get breached for all kinds of reasons. Getting breached by a 17-year-old who's downloaded some malware tool off the internet and he's simply scanning external IP addresses. Your company doesn't understand the threats they face, so they don't put the right perimeter controls on. And now, because of some 17-year-old with no cybersecurity hacking skills whatsoever has pushed the big green button on this downloaded tool he got, you've been breached. Understanding what the threats are, the huge, wide spectrum of things that we face today is an extremely good starting point from a breach causality standpoint. Ignoring the risks and vulnerabilities over revenue. This goes back to sort of poor culture, poor leadership. Choosing revenue over protecting our client's reputation is not something I think is going to play anymore. Part of our revenue model must be protecting our client's data, because it sure looks ugly from the other perspective if it's a number of slides that didn't make it into this deck, but we have some demonstrative slides that help us understand sort of what the costs have been to some of these companies, even recent settlements. Emblem Health, a huge settlement with the AG in the state, plus they have to turn around and do this huge evaluation on a biannual basis, costing them tens of millions of dollars ultimately. Target, I could go on and on, Under Armour or Saks Fifth Avenue, all of these very recent breaches causing double-digit millions of dollars in fines and regulations when they very well could have prevented those breaches. I've done a dissection of several of these very large breaches, resulting in tens of millions of dollars in settlements. And at the end of the day, most of the time it comes down to a very narrow scope of things that people just decided to ignore. Inexperience. And then my favorite here, breach causality, is hubris. Back again to leadership culture, believing that you've outsmarted the world and that you've made this very small footprint for yourself, and you're going to process this data, you're going to put it up in Relativity 1, and you're out. You don't have any liability here. You don't have any sort of influence from your client or by regulators, because you're basically passing that data along. That's not true anymore, and I believe that hubris is going to get folks in trouble.
Thank you for that. So with regard to risks, in addition to building good security, leadership, and culture, what should practitioners do to avoid risks, specifically in e-discovery?
Yeah, some of these that we've listed on this slide, Nick, it's a great question. I appreciate it's being asked. Are sort of, in the IT world, we call them bare metal, right? Just sort of fundamental things that you can do to quickly get or cut in half the risks that you're assuming with client data, using hygienic and secure collection methodologies. If you're going to get a PST from somebody's computer, go get that PST with Encase or FTK. Don't just export that to a thumb drive. Now, a lot of times vendors don't have the opportunity to do that. They feel like they don't have the obligation. They feel like doing that would be more expensive. They're not willing to spend that money, or the client doesn't want to spend the money to do that. But I do think we owe our clients to make sure that they understand, if we don't do this in a forensically sound manner, that we have these risks. Are you willing, Mr. Client, to assume these risks? And if they are, you still have the burden to protect yourself, but you then now have a line in the sand with your client, and we understand the liability bifurcation. Understanding the source data environment, as well as what are the industry-specific regulatory burdens that my client has. And this isn't just for a particular set of data from a client. So if you have a client who is multi-jurisdictional or has many departments, and I think I'm only getting data from one department, it doesn't really have any regulatory controls, that might not very well be true, because you might have emails in that corpus that come from other departments that may contain. So even a help desk might have HIPAA data in it. If one of the HIPAA processors at that company has decided to file a ticket with help desk and include an email that is causing them heartburn, that might very well have HIPAA data in it, or PCI data. Having those individual controls in place to help you understand that, you can only do that if you clearly understand your client's regulatory burdens. The one that I can't stress enough is a FIPS compliant FTP server. The day of FTP should be dead. There shouldn't be anybody on this phone using regular FTP services anymore. I would suggest even SSL FTP today is not enough, although it's better. Using a FIPS compliant FTP server will go a very long way to guaranteeing the security of the data as you import that into your environment. Again, network segmentation. Cannot stress that enough. It is one of the #1 drivers of malware infection across an organization. It's bad enough that we may get phished at a particular machine in HR, but when that machine gets infected, we can't prevent it from moving into finance or IT because we don't have good network segmentation, or we don't have good network segmentation analytics. It's just inexcusable in today's computing world. Using advanced malware scanning for your imports. Because we can't scan AV on systems we're using to process data, then we have to do that before we begin to process it. We have to understand what's in our corpus. Now, there are going to be a lot of questions here, right? What do I do with a quarantine file? If I have a .doc in my corpus and that .doc is a relevant document, it's responsive, I have a burden to tell the litigants about that file. You absolutely do. And I think we have a slide here where we talk a little bit about how we can get ahead of that. Develop infected file protocols here, pre-trial conferences to make sure that when we have a quarantine file, which in my world, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around a 1 gig processing that you don't find some form of infection, that you don't find some form of spamware, adware, or some other form of unhealthy file. Even if it's not weaponized, it's an unhealthy file. Should we be processing that file? Probably. Should we be giving that file to third parties? Probably not. So there's a huge chasm between deciding to process and deciding not to produce. How do you do that with the court telling you that you have to be 100% responsible for 100% of the corpus? So deciding in pretrial conference how that will be handled, developing a protocol with the other litigants and the court, having the court's blessing on that protocol should be done ahead of time. You guys should be strategizing today about how you would tackle that in the future, right? So you should not be giving a file or putting a file for review that's been infected. You're going to have a counselor at some point who decides he wants to see that file. He's going to download that file to his local desktop, and then the deal is done. He's infected now, and now we've got all kinds of problems. The last thing I would say is use advanced malware scanning again for our exports. Let's make sure we didn't miss anything. Let's be 100% sure, as close to 100% as we can be, that we're not producing these infected or weaponized files to third parties.
So at this point, let's tie it back into the e-discovery lifecycle, and can you use a legal hold to evaluate some of this stuff?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we discovered some time ago is that the Relativity litigation hold server is good for a lot of stuff that's not litigation hold, right? It's a great engine for helping us deploy what we call sort of self-assessment campaigns. So we help clients understand how they may self-assess themselves by developing deep analytical questions based on a particular industry or their environment themselves. So we create what we call these self-assessment campaigns. So for example, you have a client that is 3 or 4 jurisdictional regulation responsibilities that they have to be concerned with. And they've got 10 different departments of people doing all these various tasks. And we find out they don't really have a very good policy library. They don't really have these mechanisms in place. The best way to sort of find out where they are is to email these campaigns. We have, in some cases, we're able to deliver campaigns with 100 different, very focused questionnaires. One of the things people hate about questionnaires is I'm getting all these questions I don't have an answer to. I'm in server group. I don't know anything about network engineering. Well, using the Relativity litigation hold server, we're able to create very specific campaigns with very specific questions to very specific skill sets, so that one, we get people to answer because they don't feel like they're wasting time. We can make these compulsory. We can use the litigation hold server to do escalation to people's supervisors if they don't respond. People can answer the questionnaire and pause halfway through and then get to that again later when they have an opportunity or seek guidance for an answer. We use this questionnaire now very healthily with a lot of our larger clients, because one of the things that we do is we do these very large evaluations of client cybersecurity posture, is trying to get that frontline information, trying to get up to speed with how they are handling the various or specific protocol that we're concerned with in a particular interview. From an e-discovery vendor space, this is a very valuable strategy for learning from your clients what kind of data they have, what regulations do they have. Create these campaigns, use the litigation hold server intelligently to communicate with your clients and record those answers in a SQL database for posterity's sake, so that, God forbid, we do have an event based on a file we got from a client and we did all the right things. we're able to go back to the client to defend ourselves and say, look, we asked you all these questions, you declined to answer, or you answered with an answer that turned out ultimately not to be accurate, and now we're in this position. So let's start from here, new ground zero, let's start and get this fixed. So we use the litigation hold server to deliver these self-evaluation questionnaires, sometimes with as many as several hundred respondents across huge variance of departments and geolocations and regulatory expectations. Put all that data into, obviously the litigation hold server's got the same Relativity SQL backend, right? So now I have the power of data analytics, and I'm able to slice and dice that data in a myriad of different ways so that I can understand now what I'm being told by my client. And I would suggest that you guys investigate this as a way to help you understand your world. Maybe it's an onboarding process now for future clients. Before I take your client data, Mr. Client, here is this email campaign. It's 20 questions per individual skill set. We'll get to this really quickly. I have this information. I've memorialized it. And now I can even produce this to the court should I ever be compelled to sort of understand where we started from.
I think that's a very good use case for relativity legal hold outside of the traditional hold processes that people use it for. So, and like you mentioned, tying it back into slicing and dicing that information into different ways. You can use the relativity dashboards if you want, or even get it out from relativity and do your analysis outside of it if it needs to be done. So thank you for sharing those thoughts.
You're welcome. So at Alvarez, we use Tableau to sort of serve that data because a lot of times we want to be able to drill down into that data. So this data from Relativity Hold is very federatable. You can share this data with other various dashboards and lots of other tools. It can even be pulled into your SIM, right? So we do this as well for clients where we pull this data into SIM and then we aggregate and correlate that data so that SIM results are tied back to sort of the processes that individual groups are using, and we're able to show, hey, the server group doesn't really understand their policies. There's a major gap, or there's no language in our policies to cover this particular vulnerability. So let's address this.
True. In the last 5 minutes that we have, so your closing thoughts, the key takeaways that people can take away at the end of this webinar.
Sure. Thank you, Nick. So I think the first thing here is stop thinking compliance first. Start thinking security first. If you think about security first and you do this in a wholesome way, you will find compliance. So instead of shooting to be compliant and hoping that you're also secure, that is the wrong thinking. We should be thinking about security. Compliance will come. And then I think this is the word that we use all the time at Alvarez, thinking risk astute. Is my posture always aware of the risk and vulnerabilities that I have? Or am I aware of the threats? Is this part of my constant conversation? When you're risk astute, it's part of your culture. It's part of your DNA. You must do a better job of understanding the environment around you, not only from your client's data, but taking a holistic view of your processing. If you've thrown down 5 servers and you've installed Relativity and you have a couple of FTP servers and a domain controller and you're just happily processing data, you're not doing it right. There should be a lot of other controls in place. You should have other systems that are helping you look at the data as it's passing through your processing systems. Think risk astute. Always be aware of your cybersecurity risks. And then ask yourself, ask experts, ask the world, what am I not thinking of? What am I not aware of? I'm an e-discovery vendor. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I don't understand this. You should be seeking advice from those who do this for a living. You should hire counsel to help you understand this. You should hire an expert, Alvarez Marsal, or a lot of others in the world who can help you understand these things, where you are and what's your risk. At the end of the day, if you're thinking risk astute, you've got all the right questions and the right answers. Even if you don't, because you can't afford or there's no budget, whatever, if you can't put the right protocols in place, at least you understand and you can make risk astute decisions. Don't just blindly make computing systems decisions. The IT world really doesn't understand the cyber world, right? There's really sort of if you're having server guys help you with your cybersecurity, you're probably not getting the most healthy cybersecurity possible. having the right skill set do that work for you or help you understand that is really the only way you're going to tackle this very complex and comprehensive topic.
Thank you for those thoughts. It seems like we have a few questions that have come in. One that is interesting that caught my attention was how different is cybersecurity from data governance and e-discovery?
So data governance is, if I understand the question correctly, data governance is part of a healthy cybersecurity program. Having a data governance, and a lot of times we'll call that a risk management or an information risk governance a department or procedure, that is a valid part of a cybersecurity. A lot of folks will try to do that on its own, absence of its integration into the cybersecurity program. I think that is a mistake. Information governance is a very healthy part of a cyber program. It's required to do cyber governance correctly. Asset management is a prime example of that as part of a risk and governance program. If you don't have solid asset management skills, you can't possibly protect information or assets that you're unaware of. So that would be an example of how that is part of a good cyber program.
Thank you. We seem to have a few more questions that come in. We are short on time, so we'll get back to the people who have sent in these questions back via email. And just in closing remarks, thank you for joining us today. There will be a survey available as you exit the webinar, so do take a minute to let us know your thoughts, and we use this feedback to improve future events. I also wanted to take the time to provide a plug for Relativity Fest 2018. It's a little earlier this year, between September 30th and October 3rd in Chicago. Registration is open, so if you would want to hear from more speakers like John, both from the industry and also speakers from within Relativity, you're welcome to join us at Fest. You can visit relativityfest.com. And that basically brings us to the end of the webinar. I know we are at time, so thank you, John, for taking time, and thanks for attending the webinar.
It was my pleasure, Nick. Thank you, and thank you to Relativity for having me at Fest and, again, talking about this today.
Thank you.